Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Adam Johnson. I'm a disputes partner here at Herbert Smith Freehills. Like many other disputes lawyers across the city, I've spent a great deal of time over the course of the last 10 years dealing with banks and with bankers, managing the fallout from the financial crash of 2008. That's involved dealing with a lot of interesting and stimulating issues, and also, unusually for a commercial lawyer, dealing with a huge amount of emotion as well, because people have been understandably concerned to try and understand what caused such a calamity, and more specifically, if they can find that person who was responsible for it. It seems to me that actually the problems that we encountered now 10 years ago were rather more systemic than the result of individual activity. And now, 10 years on, I hope, shorn of emotion, is a good time to look back objectively at what happened and to look forward into the future and to think about how banks and financial institutions might do things differently. It's perhaps not coincidence that that same 10-year period has seen a huge growth in the area of business and human rights. Our own practice here in this firm now has a large and vibrant and market-leading practice in the area of business and human rights. We have a number of members of that practice here this evening, including Stéphane Brabant, who's come over from Paris, and I hope you'll find time to speak to him and to speak to other members of our group later on. But 10 years ago, the idea that a large commercial law firm would have had a self-standing group dedicated to the business of business and human rights would largely have been unthinkable. And what this suggests to me is that increasingly businesses are using human rights law and practice, the human rights framework, as a kind of prism through which they can scrutinize their own activities. And we might say that banks and financial institutions, given their own recent history, are prime candidates for that kind of close scrutiny. And some big questions arise. What are banks for? What is their function in the modern world and in modern society? How can they be managed so as to maximize their positive impact in the future and minimize their negative impact? To answer big questions, you need some big thinkers, and I'm pleased to say we have a number of big thinkers here this evening. And it's my duty and my pleasure to introduce them to you briefly. Our moderator is Phil Bloomer, who's Executive Director at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre based here in London. Annalisa Dodd, who I think will be joining us shortly. Yep. Is MP for Oxford East and Shadow Treasury Minister here in the UK. David Pitt-Watson, ex-director of Hermes, Pembroke Visiting Professor at the Judge Business School at Cambridge University, and Clare Richards is Programme Manager of ShareAction. And finally, but perhaps most importantly of all, we have Professor David Kinley, Chair in Human Rights Law at the University of Sydney Law School. I first met David, I think, about 8 or 9 years ago when we hosted a session here in the office. It is quite extraordinary, looking back over that time, how things have moved on. And it's a great pleasure, David, to have you with us here again. Ladies and gentlemen, they're your panel. Thank you to them for coming. Thank you to you for coming. And with that, let me hand over to your moderator for the evening, Phil Bloomer. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks again for coming. Also, thank you to Adam for the introduction, but also to Herbert Smith Freehills for the very generous offer to host this in their building this evening. We, at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, essentially decided that this was a key moment to put on this event because David's book really arrives at a critical juncture at this present time. You all know about the extraordinary divorce between finance, the traditional divorce between finance, the world of finance on one side and the human rights movement on the other. Both worlds pretty much look at each other completely baffled and flummoxed for most of the time. And so it's important that occasionally there have been some useful engagements. And previously, those have led to things like the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, the TUN Group, the Equator Principles. But I think the mood changed rapidly and substantially with the 2008 global financial crisis. We know that because the Edelman Trust Barometer has demonstrated to us the collapse in public trust in global markets, that being particularly focused on banks and finance. And the public generally starting to equate global markets not with a golden age, as Mark Carney has described, but actually in terms of increased levels of inequality, precarious employment, stagnant wages, and rootless corporations and increased environmental damage. And so it's these things that are starting to make everybody concerned about what is the future, particularly as we've got unscrupulous politicians around the world that are prepared to exploit the fears that that kind of worldview generates. And so I think now is the time when we need to look more deeply at business and human rights generally, but of course, finance as the owners of capital, as the directors of capital. And so that's why we think it's so important now. Because one answer to the crisis has to be putting human rights more at the heart of business than it has been in the past. And I think it's true to say that elements of finance and elements of the human rights movement have sought to come together as, in certain constellations over the last few years to look at how they can work more closely together. Investors basically want metrics of materiality, if you want. And so one of the initiatives has been of the corporate human rights benchmark, know the chain, of issues such as Oxfam's latest behind the barcodes, modern slavery registry. These are all elements to start to provide the metrics that we believe will help, because they will demonstrate the leaders that are out there in each of the sectors, the leaders that deserve access to capital and deserve access to cheaper capital because they're running fewer human rights risks, but equally heighten the risks of those laggard companies that are doing very little, that should have a higher price to their capital. And yet that is not being translated at the moment into those price signals. For us as well, these kind of benchmarks and rankings are also an attempt to demonstrate to politicians where regulatory action is useful and necessary. Because if the leading companies are already demonstrating what can be possible in terms of responding to a moral imperative, and which is also commercially viable in terms of response to human rights abuse, then equally there must be a space into which politicians can move forward and provide a higher minimum standard of corporate behaviour through regulatory action and indeed through incentives. So we believe it's a key time for those reasons, but it's also a key time because the Sustainable Development Goals expect a massive investment to achieve those goals. It's discussed at $4 trillion per year for developing countries alone. And equally at the same time, I just come back from China, where the Belt and Road Initiative is already providing about 900 million of investment, 900 billion of investments in infrastructure in either projects that are underway or projects that are planned. So that's another whole area of massive investment where we need to try and ensure that human rights are brought in. So for all those reasons, we're going to have what is going to be a great panel that will follow David's initial speech, and then there'll be time for questions and answers. So without further ado, David, would you like to lead us off? From the podium or from where you're sitting?
Oh, I'd like to take your lead. Can I do it from here?
Oh,
so
good.
I prefer that, if everyone's happy with that. Well, thank you very much, and let me just thank everyone involved in holding this event and hosting it. Herbert Smith Freehills and the Resource Centre. It's a fantastic combination, and to those who have agreed to speak to the book after me as well. Actually, just on the point that Adam made, he's quite right. I did give a little brown bag lunch talk here on human rights and finance about 8 years ago, much smaller gathering than this. But that itself was an indication, I think, that a firm like this would host such a thing. Even a small brown bag lunch was a good indication. But I do remember that on that day, Adam introduced me by saying, well, the topic today, ladies and gentlemen, is banks and human rights, finance and human rights. And I must say, in my 25 years of working with big banks and big businesses, I've never heard those two words together. And I wonder whether it's actually changed. I think from what Adam has just said, perhaps it has changed. But anyway, I gave that talk then, and it was really a kernel of an idea that then led to this book 8 years later. The thesis of the book is, in fact, extremely simple. It's a two-way dependency of the relationship between between finance and human rights. First of all, human rights need manifestly, obviously to an audience like this, finance in order to achieve their ends. But finance needs human rights for its legitimacy. It is a means, not an end, and the ends to which it is put are important, in fact, critical to its legitimacy. And one of those ends, sort of broad encapsulation, is the notion of human rights. In the book, I find, for me anyhow, a challenge to deal with the broad definitions of both finance and human rights. Finance itself, and it's one of the reasons why I thought I'd knock this over in a couple of years, actually. Shortly after being here, I'd come back again and launch the book, but that's not the way it works out. But finance, I've tried to cover it all, well, in the sense of tried to cover the areas and what their relevance are to human rights. So it's not just foreign direct investment, it's not just derivatives, it's not just the retail banking, but it's also the shadow banking system. It's tax and our ambivalence towards it. It's international and illicit financial flows. It's sovereign wealth funds. It's remittances. It's aid. And it's philanthropy. With respect to human rights, what I tried to do was to tone down the international human rights instruments part of the book. I wanted this, and it is being sold by OUP as a trade book, to be more accessible, not to be an academic book. So I sort of tried to remove the prose of international human rights law and stick it into the poetry of everyday life. So really talking about how human rights exist in our everyday existence, not in the form of our right to freedom of expression or such, but rather our right to be, or our expectation to have a degree of security, of dignity, of respect, of opportunity. So that's the way in which I tried to phrase it. And indeed, a word that encapsulates the relationship is one of enrichment. The idea that there are certain minimum levels of security, respect, and opportunity that describe, capture the idea of a relationship between finance and human rights. But the baseline question for me became then, what does financial enrichment play? What role does it play in the promotion and protection of human rights? Well, most crucially, finance is merely a vehicle, but one that requires direction and control, a sort of Siri or a Google Maps voice directions to get us to where we want it to go. So I'm with Adam Smith on this. I think that Smith is right, that the selfish pursuit of one's own financial interests can produce a bigger financial pie, and that pie can benefit you, the individual, who is selfishly pursuing her ends, but also, critically for me and for, much more importantly for Smith, derivatively, it can benefit everyone else in the community. But of course, it all hangs, for me and for Smith, on the management of that degree of selfishness, because it cannot be untrammeled. So the management of this selfish pursuit, greed is perhaps the prosaic word to use, focuses on how the financial pie is baked and, much more importantly, how it is apportioned. Because this trope of enrichment in the human rights and financial relationship brings problems as well as possibilities. It's sort of like an enormous, all-encompassing drama. And I just want, in the few minutes I have, to just dance lightly across the stage, pausing briefly at some of the main players in this. The first player, if I can call it that, is the sheer power of finance. On the positive side of the ledger, it has enormous emancipatory potential. Adam alluded to that in his introduction. It has and can increase our personal and state wealth. You look at the raw statistics for poverty. In many of our lifetimes, in 1980, 40% of the world's population lived under $1.9 a day PPP. But anyhow, we're in extreme poverty. Now it's less than 10%. A lot of that has got to do with China. But finance has had a role to play in that. There's also been a real spread in financial inclusion. The poor are bankable, and they really do know the value of their portfolios. There's a marvelous book called Portfolios of the Poor. They may be tiny, but they know what every cent is doing. They are consummate financiers in their own small way. The cycle of poverty is something that they can break out of if they are given the chance to be able to leverage themselves, as I say, in their own small way. But on the negative side, we've had with great wealth, enormous and increasing great inequality. We've also had, and that's one of the reasons why we have this enormous inequality, huge destabilizing debt at all levels, personal, community, state, and corporate. Also, with respect to financial inclusion for all of us, the poor as well as the not so poor and the rich, but particularly the first two of those categories, it has promoted, allowed rent-seeking behavior on the part of financiers, where the higher costs of those risks and those debts are in effect passed on to all of us. Transaction fees, interest rates, insurance premiums, and it applies to the poor. Just look at what the poor, relatively poor, are charged in respect of remittances and are charged with respect of microfinance. So in this, one is prompted with the question of what is the proper moral, legal, and practical line that we might navigate between the negative and the positive side of this immense power of finance. Well, one way, and this is an area that I spent some time on in the book, is to step out of the long shadow of what I call financial exceptionalism. Because the financial sector's power has been such that it has been able to accrue to itself, claim to itself, this exceptionalist status. Think, for instance, of the implicit government guarantee that exists for all banks, particularly the bigger banks. In fact, the bigger you are, the more likely that you are going to be saved. So it's too big to fail. We have a revolving door of regulation. That is, the regulators are drawn from the ranks of the regulated. We have an ethical deficit. I still find it incredible that in the United States, here and in Australia, it's still not a legal obligation that financial advisors have a fiduciary duty to put the interests of those who are there serving above themselves. I mean, isn't that quite incredible? Would we ever expect a medical professional to put her interests, whatever they are, above ours? No, we wouldn't. So why are we accepting that financiers can at the very least, have their interests at the same level as ours, sometimes not even just at the same level, but greater. We have this cavalier attitude towards criminal conduct within the financial sector, fueled by this whole idea of too big to convict. It's extraordinary in the United States at the moment, the number of cases that have been brought against banks, but have been settled as deferred prosecution agreements. With respect to some of them, it goes into billions, tens of billions of dollars. It's a classic case of recidivism. So it's obviously not working. Also, you've got this notion of, well, we're all doing it, so why pick on us? And that's a real sort of first mover problem for the regulators. Warren Buffett calls it the 5 most dangerous words in economics. Everyone else is doing it. And our trust in banks has clearly plummeted. As Phil referred to, the Edelman Trust Barometer has shown that over years leading up, but particularly after the global financial crisis. In the book, I talk about this wonderful behavioral economist experiment involving cheating on coin tossing, trying to work out whether banks actually attract cheats or whether they create cheats. I'll say a little bit later on, but in this experiment, they asked a control group beforehand whether they would expect bankers to be more cheat-worthy than medical professionals and various other groups, including prisoners. Bankers were considered more likely to cheat than prisoners. However, we laugh, I laugh too. We are part of the problem because the greed in finance feeds but also reflects the greed in society. We binge on debt in the way in which our forebears, indeed our parents, would find shocking. I was looking at recent statistics here in the United Kingdom. In 1980, in the early 1980s, our debt to GDP ratio was 40, well, not ratio, but percentage was 40%. In other words, we owed, all of us, corporations, the government, and us as individuals, our full debt was 40% of GDP. It's now, just 30 years later, 4 times that. It's 160% of GDP. And all of us, the corporations, the state, and us as individuals, you won't be surprised about that when you look at your mortgages, have risen in the same 4 ways. There is still a deification of the financial sector. Extraordinary. There has been a drop since 2008, but it's picked up again. Michael Lewis, who wrote Liar's Poker and wrote The Big Short to excoriate finance, he said what a shit organization it was to be involved in, effectively. That's what he said. It was maybe not quite those words, but that's what he meant. But he said what was extraordinary is that his mailbag was full of those who wanted to be more like the people he was depicting in Liar's Poker. Indeed, I was looking recently at the number of applicants for internships and ground-level entry jobs into the big banks. It's still running at between 100 and 250 applications per available position. So people still want to get in there. 260 years ago, Adam Smith called this the corruption of moral sentiments, this deification of finance. We also have this ambivalent attitude towards tax. We do towards banks as well, probably not as ambivalent as it once was. But anyway, tax ambivalence. That is, on the one hand, we seek to minimize, it's a rational thing to do, our own tax liabilities. But when we look at what corporations are doing, we see that corporations have this transfer pricing role in which they are able to shift, in recent statistics, up to 40% of all their profits into artificially created tax havens. So what we need, and this is where the book goes, is a realignment of moral sentiments. Is this too optimistic? Well, it requires certainly internal conversion, such things as the UK banking standards, and there's something going on in the same way in Australia, but also external compulsion, more criminal enforcement, more reputational outrage. Are there any indications of this? Well, there are some. The cheating experiment that I referred to earlier shows, in the end, that it wasn't banking was attracting cheats. It was more creating cheats. In other words, it was the culture within finance that was creating this cheating, unethical attitude. So we can change it. And certainly we're seeing a rise in social bonds and in social impact bonds. Larry Fink's famous letter out of BlackRock at the beginning of this year indicates that even big financiers are starting to invest in socially beneficial investments. So the conclusion that the book reaches, is that we all have responsibilities. If this undoubted power in finance is going to be harnessed for the good of all and not just to be apportioned or appropriated for the benefit of the privileged few. But first and foremost, it is the financial sector and our political leaders that have to heed the message that finance is merely a service industry, one that must earn the trust of the public, as the Lambert Banking Standards Review put it. It is a servant of society, not its master. This requires the nudge of soft law, I would suggest, alongside the stick of hard law. But human rights advocates, and I would suggest the community, the wider community as a whole, have a responsibility also. That is to make sure that the message is delivered to our leaders, both in finance and politics, as cogently and as convincingly as possible. Which means more than simply cursing the darkness of finance, but importantly, to light a candle to show the way. Now, certainly, this requires a robust engagement with finance, but it has to involve a knowledgeable, not just rhetorical understanding of finance on our part.
Thanks very much. Fantastic, I think, in terms of an overview, particularly of the book and all the evidence that you've compiled there. So thanks ever so much for that. I'd like to now just give a welcome to Anneliese, who was introduced earlier in her absence, but Annalisa Dodd, who's the Shadow Treasury Minister, and obviously a Member of Parliament alongside that. So thanks very much for coming in. We realise that you lead a busy life. It's going to be even busier for the next 10 minutes because you're on. So we'd like very much just to welcome you and to ask you to provide any responding remarks.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Phil. And I'm very sorry, David, that I wasn't there for all of your remarks. I'm afraid I've just come from the Commons where Theresa May was kind of mid-statement. We're all given a paper copy of her statement where she referred to one resignation, but between the statement being printed out and her giving the statement, there had been another one. So it's been quite a busy afternoon. So I'm very, very sorry that I'm coming to you late. I really enjoyed reading this book. I think it's a terrific read. In fact, may I say it's great summertime reading. It'll get you all fired up while you're having a glass of wine, maybe with your friends, and tell them about all the things that need to change. And certainly lots of really interesting nuggets as well that I took from this book. Just a few fascinating findings from David. Global financial crisis affected the world's poorest countries far, far more significantly than the richest. And I think very often in the UK, we would look at countries like Greece, for example, and think about what they went through during that financial crisis. But when you look at the impact on the most highly indebted countries, you can see really where the cost of that lack of appropriate risk management was felt. Secondly, the total annual debt repayments made today by low and middle income countries to creditors in rich states are still equivalent to nearly 6 times what they receive annually in aid from those states, which was, I think the magnitude of that difference was very significant when I found out about it. And then lastly, I really enjoyed, David, your I wouldn't say back of the envelope calculations because they're much more erudite than that, but looking at exactly how much different groups do give to charity, when of course we often hear different suggestions about how much, for example, in particular, ultra-high net worth individuals are contributing. And clearly there's some wonderful examples of that, like Bill Gates and others, but I think you showed very, very clearly that that is a minority activity, and that they might give substantially less proportionally of their wealth to charity than the average person. David's obviously set out his overall kind of philosophical viewpoint just now, and I certainly found the book a very good way of linking together human rights concerns and I suppose some of the very highfalutin, more theoretical aspects of finance with how they directly impact on people on Main Street or on No Street, as I think you put it really eloquently. I wanted to talk really briefly about some of the kind of suggested responses that David sets out in the book, and maybe some reflections on where I think they're useful, where I think they could go further, and some other issues that I think we need to be cognizant of as well when we're talking about finance and human rights. And I think David's focus is very interesting. A lot of it is on how we can harness the power of esteem, as he calls it. So how can we kind of work with the grain of motivation within markets a lot of the time and try and achieve positive outcomes through that. But also by using the controlling power of the state so that it can superintend the invisible hand of the market and guide the intangible hand of esteem. And you talk about 3 different levels. First, about how the state can aid with the identification of risk, so that we identify risk more effectively. And there are lots of really interesting suggestions in David's book around that. I think that one area we can look at further, and not just saying this to suck up to Phil and all the work that he does, but it's about actually how we can ensure that we use the power of data to surface some of these issues around human rights. We have, in theory, a legal obligation around modern slavery in this country. How many companies actually comply with those requirements? When you have bodies like the Centre for Business and Human Rights, you can find out about that. But we have a whole proliferation now of different legal requirements and reporting requirements, but not enough bringing together of those requirements in one place, I would say, so that all of us can actually see where companies are and finance interests are actually complying with those requirements. So I think we need to think much more carefully about that. Secondly, I thought it was interesting, this question, when it comes to some of the European developments around credit rating agencies and some of the discussions that went on around them. I used to be a member of the European Parliament for 2 years, and it's very interesting talking to colleagues where they were saying, well, questions arise like, was the problem just there wasn't enough competition over ratings by credit rating agencies? If we'd had more, would we be in a better position? Was their mandate the wrong one? Were the incentives aligned wrongly for them? Or do we need some kind of public role in this ratings process? And as people will know, there is now, there has been European moves to ensure that there is the creation of a European-based credit rating agency. Those kinds of debates and discussions are surfacing at the moment in the UK around audit as well. Of course, particularly today, we just had a report on auditing in relation to Carillion. Again, questions about, well, was there an adequate competition, or is this just a question about choice? When you have a company, you talked about too big to sanction or to prosecute or jail. When you've got some companies like Carillion or Serco and others which are potentially too big to audit, unless you're a giant auditor, is there really choice there? Do we have the tools that we need to actually examine whether risk is being identified properly? Secondly, David suggests the state can aid in the allocation of risk to do so more efficiently. And I think there's some very interesting points about how the overall approach to risk, obviously, in markets has changed very significantly. The whole approach to hedging risk has changed very, very substantially. And I think, again, we can think about the role that government can play as an identifier of systemic risk, because often it's only public sector actors that can have the legal cover to take action in relation to systemic risk. So again, thinking about some of the European level developments that we've had, where you have now the European Systemic Risk Board, they have the same in the UK, looking to identify systemic risks and able to take action against individual companies when they might be doing something that's perfectly legal, but when that activity multiplied across many, many other companies doing the same thing could pose systemic risks. So perhaps we need to think about that process as well. And then finally, David suggests the state can also aid in the relationship between risk management and the rule of law. Obviously, we've talked already about whether sanctions need to be stiffer, whether there needs to be a more dissuasive process from law and legal processes. In the book, David also talks about whistleblowers, and I think these were very important in relation to HSBC, yes, but also in relation to tax avoidance and evasion, particularly when it comes to LuxLeaks, Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers cases. But I think there are also questions about where does the responsibility lie? I mean, we have a very confused regulatory landscape around a lot of issues in the UK. You think about money laundering, for example, where there's over 20 regulators, as I understand it, very unclear how they talk to each other, who exactly you go to if you see an instance of money laundering. So those were the areas that David had identified. Very quickly, I'm going to finish off and say I think perhaps we can be even more ambitious than David's prospectus in two areas. First, ownership. Secondly, political responsibility. First, when it comes to ownership, I think we've got to recognise that business is inherently distributional, and through that process, political choices are made because, ultimately, economic resources define how much political power people have. I found a really interesting example of this when I was working on the Western Balkans, and the thought was you could just graft supposedly mutual regulatory processes around, say, energy onto that context. But you can't do that when ownership is ethnicised, when you've got one ethnic group owning all the assets and other ethnic groups not owning any of them. So that ownership is distributional a lot of the time. Now, we've got in Britain an interesting discussion around vulnerable consumers that's developing, but we very, very infrequently talk about those consumers who are vulnerable because they don't have ownership of hardly any assets. We very infrequently talk about how goods, including financial goods, cost so much more when you are on a low income, when you have a low asset base. And I would say also we need to think about this in the context of increasing digitisation of money. A great way to ensure that we can combat some of that money laundering and economic crime, but potentially something that could exclude many people from financial resources. But just finally, I think we do need to talk about who some of the significant actors are here. I think David in his book talks very much about different civil society actors pushing change. I would add to the ones that he mentions, and again, I'm not just saying this because you're sat here, but ShareAction as well, and Finance Watch at the European level, very, very important in generating expertise about where we can change. But I think policymakers have got a lot more responsibility here for change as well. I think that's important because very often I've had people involved in industry say to me, well, we'll just do whatever you set the rules as, we will conform with them, but we don't want to be making them ourselves. You know, that's a politician's job. So I think it is our responsibility. But also I think it's our responsibility because markets are inherently political for the reasons that I have said. And I'll just end by saying, I think this book is particularly important right now, especially in the UK context, because it looks like we might be re-entering all those debates around financial regulation, given we've just heard over the last few days that services, including financial services, won't be included within the EU deal, may well be subject to more flexibility, which could be a positive thing or which could be a negative thing if it leads to that match between risk and responsibility being loosened even further.
Thanks very much, Anneliese. And I think that final point you make about the opportunity now, but also the risks that we've got with Brexit, whether it's soft or hard or otherwise, and what on earth Boris Johnson's resignation means to people. But those are the things that we really must take on board and be active on in the next period. So there's a huge agenda for us all there. So next we have David Pitt-Watson, who's a great colleague and friend of mine. Who was the one thing that's not mentioned here is that he was also the treasurer of Oxfam for a number of years when I was there, and played an extraordinarily important role. But now we'd like you to give your short remarks.
Thanks, Phil. And look, I'm a financier, an investor, and I guess I'd like to, if I can, to sort of touch on three things. One, the bits of the book I agree with, and then for a bit of a debate as well, the bits that I don't agree with. And also to talk a little bit about what I think might be the ways forward that we can find to deliver on the bit of the book I most agree with, which is that we should be trying to fashion a financial system that promotes human welfare. That's a quote from your book, and of that I am in absolutely no doubt, and that is what we should do, just as we should for health, and for transport, and for food, and for education, and for our government, and for everything else that we have in our society. But I don't think of our education system as being a necessary evil. I see it, and I see the financial system, as being something that is tremendously important for the way in which our lives work. Let me give you an example. If you go back through the history of finance, and you look at the people who set up the first pension, so that when you were not able to earn any longer, you knew you would still have an income until you died. They were people that thought of themselves as social reformers. They were, of course, Anneliese Scots, because we know that the Scots did invent almost everything within the modern world. If you think about the people who invented the first savings bank that was for ordinary people, again, Henry Duncan Scots, they thought of themselves as social reformers. If you think about Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, he's a banker. He lends money to poor people, actually at quite high interest rates, and he wins the Nobel Peace Prize because he's transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of working women. If you go to Kenya and you look at what M-Pesa's doing, which means that instead of this crazy thing of having armoured trucks that were full of Kenyan shillings and them being robbed and then giving them to agricultural labourers who then needed to find hundreds of miles of road back to their village so that they could give their earnings to their families, they can now put it on their mobile phone and transform it. That transforms their lives. This isn't a necessary evil. This is a profoundly important part of our modern world. And here's something, if I can be a little bit parochial, if there's one industry in this world where Britain is absolutely outstanding, it is in finance. And it is one that is central to the future of our world. And it should be a system that we fashion to promote human welfare. With that, I agree. But the sort of swashbuckling dismissal of finance, I think, doesn't work. And it doesn't work, first of all, because we've got to get financiers on board with this, because if we don't, I promise you, they won't be good enough to be able to see you off. But second of all, I think if you do that, you don't see the good stuff that's going on. And there is some good stuff. I think if you were to come from Mars, indeed, if you were to be Adam Smith, Adam Smith, if you explained to him how this financial system works, he would say, absolutely no chance. People will be ripped off, completely ripped off. The system will collapse. In fact, Adam Smith thought even having a public company was a bad idea. He said if you have a public company where the shareholders and the management are different people, negligence and profusion will prevail. Actually, you put your money in a pension, it's given to a fund manager, the fund manager puts money into a company in Japan, and you believe that in 30 years' time, money will come back so that it can pay your pension. That is the most amazing social invention. And it's one that if we swashbucklingly criticize it, we could kill geese that lay golden eggs. But we do need to criticize it to make it better. That's right. But we also need to think about what are some of the things that have worked. Most of my sort of life has been in a sort of a field that people would call responsible investment. So working for pension funds to think about how you get companies to run as though they had millions and millions of shareholders, and so they had financial responsibilities and they should make a profit, but they should do that in a socially responsible way as well. And particularly in the area of the environment. And so I had the privilege of running the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative in the run-up to the Paris Conference. You know, at the Paris Conference, we had $24 trillion, even by investment standards, $24 trillion, a very, very large number indeed, telling the negotiators at Paris that they should do a much stronger deal than actually they managed to come out with. There were some things after a generation of work that the finance industry could do. Indeed, I was with a commission from Canada just this morning who, when we were agreeing 25 years ago, it was impossible to believe that the finance industry would be, the investment industry in particular, on your side in terms of the developments that we need in finance. And that also surely is what it is that we should be looking for in human rights. And I'm not sure we've made as much progress on that. And we've not made as much progress, I think, in banking as well. One of the reasons is banking is just, it's very multifaceted banking. You know, people think about banks as, I'm lending to a hydro dam. The human rights associated with lending to a hydro dam, they're very different from buying derivatives in options on oil, for example. And therefore, thinking about what these might mean is difficult. I think probably we need to start with things like the Ruggie principles. These are the human rights principles for businesses. And I was involved when I was at UNEPFI on a thing. It was commissioned by a number of banks saying, can we manage to get agreement on what the Ruggie principles mean for banks? And so it isn't the case that the banks aren't thinking about it. I mean, they are thinking about what they should do. We didn't get agreement on this, by the way. I sat in many very tense meetings where some banks from certain parts of the world simply were unwilling to sign up to those. I think we need to think about how it is we push those. I think as citizens we do need to, you mentioned Larry Fink, that the greatest thing in Larry Fink's speech is not about long-termism. He says, you should be running your companies. He owns, BlackRock owns about 5% of the shares in every company in the world. And he says to the people who are running those companies, you should think of your owners as being my clients. That's tens of millions of people who are my clients. I think there's something to build on there. I think there's a lot to build on in fiduciary duty as well. I mean, in the last 20 years, especially in the UK, we've transformed what fiduciary duty means. 20 years ago, if you went to a pension fund and said, you should be worried about your effect on the environment, you would have had an advisor, a lawyer, who would have said, under no circumstances can we consider this, don't you know about the McGarry judgment? Not today. In fact, it's transformed, and transformed, by the way, without any without any law having been changed. We've just managed to get a different interpretation of that. And why have we done that? Well, it's the second bit of the thing I really agree with you in your book, David. Because it's not just you say that we should fashion the system. You say we have the power to fashion this system so that it works towards human welfare. And that is, I think, by our demanding that the money that's in our pension funds, for example, is run in our interests and in the interests of the people that it affects. It's our demanding our rights not just as citizens, but also demanding them as investors. And I can see Phil saying I have to wind up, but I hope that that makes a very, very good introduction to the agency which more than any other campaigns for the upholding of those sorts of rights, which is ShareAction and Clare.
Thanks also for being provocative and pointing out that key issue about we have to find ways in which there will be challenges to finance, but there must also be means by which cooperation can be achieved. And I think we've found personally as the resource centre, that there are key elements of finance that are increasingly alert and aware of these issues and want to be engaged. There is also a good section that is still pretty stubborn in terms of engaging. But that we have to find a dynamic by which we engender more of that mainstream.
I think that's right, Phil. And I think also thinking about this in the context of what you're trying to do. I remember when I was doing the UN stuff, I was on a commission which had he was a former Chancellor of the Exchequer of a developing country, and I started talking about human rights. Boy, did I get an earful.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a very
I'm just thinking about how is it that we manage to pull this system in the right direction. There's some good stuff that's going on, but it's not as straightforward as saying, let's take a scythe to finance.
When I mean, just to say, in contrast to that, you'd expect. I was in China speaking with the Chinese senior people in the Chinese police, trying to make sure that we got a permit to continue our work in China a week ago, expecting a pretty hostile reaction. And in fact, the reaction was, "It's great work you're doing. We need this for the Belt and Road Initiative. We need to learn more about it." But that's not every Chinese reaction. But it was extraordinary that the Chinese police, the administrative section for the NGO law, etc., was led to immediately see the advantages of an organisation such as the Business and Human Rights Resources. And without further ado, we come to another key organisation in this area, which is, of course, Clare Richards and ShareAction. So, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I guess I'd like to just start off by seconding Annalisa and David's opinions that it is a good read. Certainly, I found it a really interesting set of vignettes that's very easy to dip in and out of and to kind of take different aspects from different parts. And yes, agree with some aspects more than others, but I think it raises some really interesting thinking points for anyone interested in this area. And, it's just a good reminder, really, that the decisions that are made in banks, in boardrooms, that they do, as Anneliese said, they do affect the lives of everyday people. It's very easy to kind of reduce people to being kind of consumers and units of capital and production in themselves, but when you actually remind yourself that they're citizens and that the impacts, the kind of precariousness of their lives leads to the kind of longer-term, medium, long-term impacts and socio-economic fissures that we kind of see coming out in all sorts of different ways. That's certainly, as Phil was saying, it's very, very timely and something that we should all bear in mind. And indeed, yes, the SDGs provide a really strong framework for how to think about how human rights, social, environmental issues are woven through so many different aspects of finance and business. But also, to keep in mind that whilst the worst effects of poverty and inequality do happen in the least developed countries, these aren't things that the UK and the global north are inoculated against either. I think just last week, JRF, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, published the latest minimum income standards for the UK, and they were showing, I think, a 30% rise over the past decade in the number of families in the UK that don't actually meet a minimum income standard here. So I think some of the points that have already been raised kind of around the knitting together that there needs to be of that kind of policy framework, the public mobilisation, the enlightened kind of purpose-led business as well, that these things don't exist in isolation, and David referred to kind of a candle in the kind of darkness. I think a candle can all too easily be snuffed out when it's just one flame, but when you have those drifting into too many metaphors, but when there are a larger candle, that can really bring about the kind of impacts that are required. I work for ShareAction. We term ourselves the Movement for Responsible Investment, and very much we're about trying to mobilise all of those different aspects. So trying to draw attention to the fact that pensions, as David mentioned, aren't something that just kind of are drawn down in 20, 30, 40 years' time, but that capital is actually acting in ways now that the interests of the saver are not necessarily solely on the maximisation of financial return on that, whilst that is very important, but also thinking what kind of world the saver wants to retire into as well, and the types of impacts that capital has in the shorter term. We work with investors, we work to challenge them, investors, banks, the financial system overall, by doing various rankings to look at how environmental, social, governance issues are incorporated within their policies and practices. But in a key aspect of our work is also working with those institutions to recognise that they do have intentions as well over trying to leverage the influence that they have, the positive influence that they can have over companies. And what we've heard very often, and something that Anneliese mentioned at the start, that investors can struggle to actually be able to separate, discern the wheat from the chaff, really, when it comes to what good performance looks like when it comes to human rights indicators and wider social indicators. And that that lack of transparency, that there's a kind of, no one really wants to be seen, or companies don't particularly want to be seen as being a leader, but they also don't want to be singled out as being a laggard. Everyone wants to be in that middle pack where you can't get picked off to it. You're not criticised, but also you're not having to justify to your shareholders maybe why you're spending some of the CEO's time on looking at indicators that aren't purely financial returns. And in working with investors and hearing that they were, as I say, struggling to kind of get that kind of sight into what was going on within companies, we realised, as so many, the Business and Human Rights Centre, CHRB, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, and others, that actually drawing more kind of comparable and meaningful data out into the open both helps the companies to work out where they sit within that pack and maybe where they're underperforming compared to their peers, but also that to the wider movement, as I say, the civil society actors, to the investors, that they can kind of get more sight too of what the longer term strategy of the company is, of be that a financial company or within the wider environment. Because without that kind of sight, there's so few incentives really to do better. There's an occasional stick that's waved to penalise, but actually, I think something that comes through a lot in the book as well is that there needs to be a more collaborative movement around this. What we found with the work of ShareAction is the project that I work on, the Workforce Disclosure Initiative, that you find companies saying actually that they're welcoming it because of the fact that it is taking a more collaborative approach, saying we recognise no one is doing this perfectly at the moment. It's not about trying to get a perfect score. it's not about scoring at the moment, but about actually, sounds cheesy, but kind of learning together what good looks like in this space and what's possible as well, so that investors aren't setting too high an expectation of what the barriers are at the moment to actually setting higher labour standards. Thank you. So I think David referred to Siri or Google Maps at the start, and I think the key thing there is that someone is programming that system, and I guess what we're looking to do really is to go, well, it's about everyone kind of feeding in what their expertise is and their interest to find a way of doing this in a way that helps to draw attention to what the kind of some of the blockers are and where the rules of the game in terms of the enabling factors of, say, pension trustees not really being able to take a longer view of what the interests of the pension saver are. That's not really in anyone's interest. It's not in the business's interest because it holds them back in terms of being able to get the best out of their employees, both within their kind of direct operations, but also the workers that are in their supply chain. Because if there's no real incentive for them to actually be kind of seeking out higher standards because they know that their competitors aren't being held to those kind of standards. So there is, very often they'll view it through the prism of there being a cost penalty, i.e. competitive loss, if they actually do pay a bit more. And so often, if you're going out to tender and you're taking the lowest, the lowest bid that you're getting, the way that the value is being squeezed out of that bid is because someone somewhere down that chain or up that chain is not getting paid adequately. They're working in conditions that aren't actually upholding the kind of standards that can help them to do the job well, but also to be able to go home at the end of the week and see their family without the WDI. We've worked with Oxfam to produce some case studies, and one of the most striking things about one that was about the fashion trade, the garment sector in Myanmar, was just someone talking about the simple step of the sewing machine not having a needle guard on it, and it's like that would cost pence, a few cents to actually put that in place, and yet people are living in danger, working in danger of losing their sight or being injured, just because there isn't kind of the local regulation or there aren't the kind of audits that actually look at that and take a wider view of what the business's impact is, rather than just trying to keep costs at the minimum level. So a very thought-provoking book, and look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Claire. So now we've got about 30 minutes for questions. After that, there's an hour for drinks. So I'm going to try and make sure that we finish at 7 or perhaps 7:05, if you'll permit that extra use of your time. So we're going to move straight to questions, and then we'll finish with just a few remarks from the panel. I'd like to take clusters of 3 questions just to make sure we get them in. People can be relatively short in their questioning, please, not a long introduction followed by a very short question. And if you could also ensure that we use the mics, which are crucial. And let's head off. I've got 1, 2, and 3 first starters.
Hello, my name is Ira, and I'm a student at SOAS University of London. My question is, given the impacts that were cited by the entire panel about the impacts of the crisis or the global financial integration on developing economies, what are your main policy recommendations or implications for both core capitalist economies, such as the UK or the US, as well as those in the periphery, such as in the third world? And put more bluntly, do you believe that it may be time for capitalists or for capital controls to be somewhat reinstated in some parts of the world in order to contain the negative impacts of global financial integration? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I should have asked if people could just introduce themselves, but I very conveniently reminded me of that. Thank you.
Robert McCorkadale. I run a consultancy called Inclusive Law on Business and Human Rights, and I work at times with parts of the finance sector. And they often ask, well, what is the UN guiding principles on business and human rights? How much help is that? And in your book, David, you only give it a small amount of weight, which is interesting. But of course, then, David, you mention banks' response, which has been heavily, heavily criticised, because the banks we're just a leverage role. We don't have any calls or contribution. Yeah. When in fact, there's a work done by, say, pension companies which show that actually if they finance an activity which leads to an abuse of human rights, they're facilitating quite clearly very often that abuse of human rights. So I'm interested in that, and related to that is whether or not there's a need for more national legislation. You mentioned, because of the Modern Slavery Act, but it has no enforcement provisions at all. I mean, the French duty of vigilance takes quite a considerable distance down. So I'm interested in your views as to UN guiding principles and whether it needs to be put further in some form of stronger regulation. I have one other quick point, which is John Ruggie recently produced some statistics which showed that those who are coming now into kind of professional world and finance and that kind of thing are actually much more critical of the current financial position and are much more concerned in their financial activity to have ethical financing. And so we need to be aware we're not talking to the past, we're talking to the future.
Thanks very much, Robert. And really helpful to raise that point about young people coming in and the new talent that's emerging in finance. And then there was, there you are, you already got the mic.
Anne-Marie Pascal, I teach business ethics and corporate responsibility at Regent's University London. Thank you for the most inspiring set of reflections from such a wide range of representatives from banking and state and the third sector. My question is about your views on the efficiency of current regulatory initiatives, two in particular, the senior manager regime in the UK, which is, of course, mostly focused on the finance sector. And perhaps more importantly, because it is more about business and human rights, the proposed treaty, the legally binding treaty, which is currently, being drafted. Actually, the draft has been published, which follows, of course, the UN guiding principles of 2012. What do you think are the chances of those kind of initiatives to bring perhaps the more traditional financial system that we are so good at in the UK to the less traditional ones, such as the example of Grameen, which of course it is utterly different. Yeah. It is built on utterly different principles, and that's why it's so successful. Or what are the chances of this kind of initiatives improving the lives of those in Myanmar that were mentioned before? I'm very keen to learn your views on those.
Thanks very much. And great questions. So we've got the issue of the global financial crisis and its effect on the core and the periphery, and is this time for capital controls? We've got the guiding principles in finance and the cause and contribution issues around abuse, and obviously the other thing being the national laws around the French due diligence, the mandatory due diligence, mandatory transparency, and how those can be used. And then finally this issue around the senior manager regime and the treaty. So if that's not enough for a quick round, obviously you can be very brief answering those questions. So who'd like to go first? I can see Anneliese is jumping in them.
Yeah, terrific questions. I will try and be really quick. First of all, I think it's a really, really important question. And this is an area where I think particularly Britain's aspirations are far more significant than the reality. So in theory, in the UK, there's meant to be policy coherence for development, which means that every policy is meant to at least not go against fostering international development. But I've just been reading the so-called Green Book, which includes the kind of financial planning regulations for governments. I know how to live, but I know you can all reflect on that. And there is reference to testing policy against its impact on different groups, making sure there's an equality impact assessment. Actually, that doesn't happen as much as it should do, but anyway, that's a separate issue. There's reference to policy testing for the impact on families, but there's no reference at all in that book to the impact on developing countries, and yet we are meant to have policy coherence for development. An area that I've particularly been working on recently is around double tax treaties, where, again, there seems to be very, very infrequently any acknowledgement of the impact that decisions made by the UK when it creates a treaty with another country, the impact that can have on that country's ability to raise revenue. But we have had the first ever vote on a double tax treaty in UK parliamentary history, I believe, which I asked for, and I was very pleased that we had it, which was on our treaty with Lesotho, where it looked like we were going to be reducing their ability to levy tax on British companies, which didn't seem to be the right thing to be doing, quite the opposite. Relating that question to the previous one, there is a multilateral instrument that's been created by the OECD to, in theory, alter all double tax treaties so that they come in line with internationally, in theory, accepted principles. I mean, there's still a lot of debate about whether they're the right principles and whether they're appropriate for the global south in particular or not. But I think it'd be interesting to think about, well, do we need to have that for investment as well? Because, of course, we have these investment agreements as well, which I think, similar to tax agreements, traditionally in the UK, have received very, very little political scrutiny. So we probably need to look at that more carefully. When it comes to the senior manager regime, certainly when we discussed this in the context of the sanctions and anti-money laundering bill, it was felt that it wasn't strong enough, it wasn't delivering as much as had been hoped for it. And then finally, when it comes to legislation, is it too complex? Are the lines of accountability too diffuse? I think yes, certainly looking again at the area of money laundering, where there's a whole proliferation of different regimes. Also, when it comes to the area of reporting, we just heard very usefully about that. Can you somehow design catch-all categories to try and help with that? Now, the UK government, in theory, well, it did consult on whether we could have a general offence of failure to prevent economic crime. Now, that happened, it closed, of course, last year. I keep asking questions, when are you going to respond to this consultation? Well, when will we find out what the future steps will be?
So, could I start with the first and the last question, which is what would be your policy prescription? And look, there's some macroeconomic things about capital controls, but if I had one policy prescription on finance, it would be that we focus on finance on what is its purpose and what are we wanting it to achieve for us in the world. And that's not how we think about it right now in terms of the way that we let it run and that we regulate it. What we do is that we assume that markets will work, and then when we go wrong, we pass another regulation. So I started off in the pensions world nearly 30 years ago. There were 3,000 pages of regulation for pensions in the UK, 3,000. This year, 166,000. 3 to 166. We can't go on like this in terms of markets and then a sort of, as I call it, whack-a-mole regulation. We need to start with a framing of what's the purpose of finance and then how do we get it to fulfill it. Incidentally, I've taught at London Business School and now at Cambridge. I know of no business school around the world, apart from those two institutions, that put on a course that is called The Purpose of Finance, and that actually does that. And if you do that, you see that ethics, by the way, are an important part of that. And by that, I mean, I don't mean being a good person. I just mean you need to have a shared ethic with people in order to have a trusting relationship to be able to trade. So that for the first and the second question. Look, the stuff on human rights in banks, I mean, it is quite complicated, what it is that you do. We did take a shot at it a couple of years ago through UNEP-FI. I think if you were trying to advise a well-intentioned bank, the paper that we wrote and we couldn't get agreement to, and I did sit on a telephone line with some very aggressive New York lawyers failing to get agreement on it. But I think actually what was written, it was written by Ruggies law firm, Foley Hogg. I think if that was a starting point, that's quite a sensible place to go from.
Thanks very much. David.
Try not to repeat, but the question about capital controls and least developed countries, we've had a real shift in the way aid is now focused. It's much less on just providing the goods through public purse, but through a combination of public purse and private purse. So it's opened up this potential of private sector development. And yet there's a real dislocation here. All DFID is doing this, AusAid, USAID, they're all doing it. The dislocation in respect of things like sovereign debt, because the debt forgiveness that so many of the public, the World Bank, DFID, and all the other state creditors have involved themselves in with the Jubilee debt forgiveness campaign in 2000 onwards, has not been replicated in the private sector. So you've got still debt, sovereign debt, odious debt in some circumstances, held by the most poorly financed and economic countries to private sector banks, to the big banks that we all know. Now that is a real serious problem. And now, of course, they're saying, well, it's a contractual obligation. We aren't in a position to be able to forgive that the way the state is because we get shareholders. Well, going back to David's point about what is the purpose of finance. With respect to the binding treaty question, the benefit, I think, of the treaty negotiations at the moment is that it sets a very heavy marker, but a way out in the distance. That is, you guys don't operate on this. Maybe one day the states will come together and agree that there should be a superstructure at an international level that fills in the gap at the moment that exists between national legislation and national extraterritorial legislation. But, of course, the big reality is that we're not going to have that anytime soon. The states agreeing to sign up to such a superstructure and architecture, it's not going to happen quickly at all, not least because the financiers are going to be in the ear and all the other TNCs and say, stop this. But the debate is there, so that's useful. To Robert's point about the GPs, David's really commented on this. I mean, the Thun Group's attempt to look at the GPs was derisory, in my view, but at least they gave it a go. But they were entering into the debate, but you could see that they immediately were shocked and think, God, people don't think that we're being quite good. Because you're not being very good. You're just saying it's too far removed from us unless we actually are involved directly in the hand that produces the Rana Plaza collapse. We're not involved. Well, that's the sort of supply chain distancing that other sectors have rejected and said, yeah, we will take responsibility. It may take it some time, but they did get there. Yeah, so those are my comments.
Thank you. Clare.
One quick response, I think, to the point that's maybe fallen through the gap so far, which is around sort of the rise of more ethical investing, ethical finance, and that, dare I say it, millennial kind of push that there is for that too. I think it's interesting to see several banks recently that are launching, marketing campaigns that do seem very specifically targeted at that kind of market. Legal & General, I saw another, they've got an online campaign. I saw a roadside ad yesterday where they're putting their ethical credentials out there on show, which I think is a really positive development because, again, as with transparency, the more information that there is out there, the more their customers can both be drawn to that and show that there is a market for it, but also that they can be held to that in terms of communicating with their pension funds or their pension savers what they are actually doing to uphold those principles that they're talking about. Having mentioned them, I must say Legal & General are a signatory to the WDI and they have been really active in helping to promote it. Other pensions for pension funds are available, obviously. But I think, also that it shows that it makes, again, moving away from Elgin, but it makes business sense as well because norms were referred to before, showing that you're actually a forward-looking company, being a forward-looking, be it a finance institution or a company that is both tracking, staying with and hopefully, getting slightly ahead of where the norms are shifting to. It makes financial sense as well as being the right thing to do.
Great, thank you.
Phil, can I just add to that?
It'll have to be short because otherwise
Well, I'm just going to say that I think one of the most important points and I know Robert teaches as well, is to say to people in human rights, in law schools and in business schools, particularly law schools, if you've got a human rights sensibility, don't think that you can't go into finance. Quite the reverse. I think right now is the time when we need people with human rights sensibilities going into finance, not seeing it as something to avoid.
Good point. So, we've only got time for 3 questions. I've seen one here, one there, and there was a lady here, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your eyes early enough, so you'll have to forgive me. Okay, so can we get the microphones to this man here first? We've got one there, Maya. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Joe Latimer. I work in legal aid, and my question is quite simple, but a big one, I think, is what do you think the impact of the fact that private banks have the ability to create money has on human rights? So I think if you look at Martin Wolf, for example, of the Financial Times, has been a big advocate for taking away private banks' ability to create money. In the UK, we've got 97% of, and this is the Bank of England statistics, is 97% of the money that's in circulation is created through private debt, and so the central bank's got basically nothing to do with it. And you know, the most obvious example of why that's an important issue for human rights is, I think, like the HSBC example, where, you know, 2013, if they had prosecuted the HSBC for what was, you know, egregious human rights violations, they would have brought the global economy to their knees yet again. So they probably actually made the right decision not to do it. If you take away the fact that the assets that a private bank like HSBC is holding, so I'll let you guys talk about it.
We've got it. That's a very good question. Thanks, Joe. And then the next one that was over there, Harriet.
I'm from International Alert. We're a peace-building charity, and we work a lot with companies about how can they invest in fragile and conflict-affected states. And so I was interested to know, like, to go back to Phil's point really about incentives, how can we get the incentives right that encourage companies to invest in more risky places, obviously in a way that respects human rights, but nonetheless not just to pull out and say we're not going there, but actually be ready to do it, and to do it in a way that actually actively contributes to peace in countries like Ethiopia or Colombia, say. And I was particularly interested to think, like, what could the role of the government be in underwriting some of those investments, but having in the underwriting a matrix so you really ensure companies are ready to do it, but they're ready to respect human rights when they do it.
Thanks very much. And then the lady here. Thanks.
Thank you. So thank you all for the interesting insights.
Introduce yourself.
Great. Sorry, Kate Larson from ERM. And I just want to pick up what Robert raised, and thank you that there have been responses, but nevertheless a bit further, that you're saying, and I'm about to read the book, you're saying, you know, the power is in our hands to shift things, and we need solutions and we need ways to do that. And whilst these are by no means perfect, nevertheless, the UNGPs have then been reflected in the OECD guidelines, where all sorts of players, trade unions, you name it, were at the table and crafting what's imperfect but respected. That's then reflected into the UK Modern Slavery Act guidance, the US import of goods made under forced labour guidance on what companies should do to prevent that risk, all sorts, you know, the French law that was mentioned, all these other. So for those of us who are working with companies, I'm seeing companies actually say, I can see there's a theme here, there's something to do, it clearly lays out what to do, this is how I can respect human rights, let's get on with it. So my question then is, hence, I guess, what were your concerns in not wanting to, you said when you opened your speech this evening that you didn't touch on these legal frameworks so much in the book. So I'm just sort of curious your thoughts then, as especially as a law professor, on I guess why you didn't dig into them too much, what you recommend that we do on the business side, and we're seeing these conversations with the banks as well, that they are saying, maybe we could follow these frameworks given they're proliferating, I guess is my point, even if imperfect. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's great. So we've got 3 questions. Excellent ones again. The issue of private banks creating money through private debt. The second one was on incentives, getting incentives right for investment in more risky places like Ethiopia or Colombia or Myanmar. And then the last one is really about this whole issue of, about the legal frameworks and the role of those legal frameworks and this rise of mandatory transparency, rise of mandatory due diligence. Are these the ways in which we can actually make a difference, or were they not? And that was particularly focused on to you, David. So we'll go in reverse order this time. Claire, why don't you go first? And this will be the final remarks, by the way, I should have said, so
Okay.
if you want to make any other remark, just wrap it in.
Sure. I might just pick up on Harriet's point about the investing in risky places aspect then. I think certainly the generating more kind of, not looking at the sort of underwriting and the policy framework side of it, but generating more understanding of where the risks are in those places and more understanding among financiers and also the companies operating there, but the role that companies play too in helping to manage those risks and helping to support the development of local economies that can, in post-conflict stages as well, be more resilient to kind of upsurges in conflict is a really important role for the purpose of finance too. And certainly, looking at somewhere like, say, DRC, where there is the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the cobalt industry has such clear and well-documented risks to it, but given the numbers of people whose income does depend on that source, but also the high prevalence of armed actors at the mining sites, there are so many complex, as you well know, so many complex issues there that turning away from that isn't something that can be done, but also turning a blind eye to it and saying, well, everyone else is operating in this, what can we possibly do? Our hands are tied, we're not law enforcement, so we'll just carry on with business as usual. That shouldn't be an option either. I think more collaborations between banks and sharing information on the types of risks that they are encountering in those kind of contexts, obviously within the kind of legal reporting or the restrictions that there are. I think that's incredibly important.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, that's a very good question about, really you're talking about leverage, about the capacity of banks to leverage themselves. And of course a lot of it is coming from us. We've wanted, the corporations have wanted the money, so they've leveraged themselves to be able to provide the money. But it was extraordinary. Before the financial crisis, some of the capital adequacy standards were as low as 1%. Now they're higher, 4, 5, 6%, but still very low. So that means, as you said, the 90+% is, as it were, paper money. Deutsche Bank, even in 2012, 2013, so 7 years after the global financial crisis, has an exposure, if it ever came to fruition, which is bigger than the GDP of Germany. The Deutsche Bank itself, just a private sector bank. So these are big issues, but of course, how do we unravel that? Well, you'd have to start to deal with all the derivatives market, because that's a lot of it where it's coming from. It's not just the normal loans, it's a derivatives market, it's a whole subset of lending. Doing that quickly is impossible. Doing it even slowly and in the long term is going to be very difficult, because we've all started to sort of rely on it. Our corporations, our state, ourselves, as I just quoted in my introduction about the level of debt that we now all hold. I don't see an easy answer to that. I'm not doubting that we need to deal with it, because of course it is the sort of submerged part of the iceberg. We only see the top, but when that little bit sort of rocks, the whole thing tips over. I don't know what the answer to that is. With respect to the question of political insurance, well, that's already in place, and it's a very good question. Export credit agencies are supposed to be doing that already. Export credit agencies are, and from a human rights perspective, and it sort of brings in your questions about law, and I do talk about law in the book, just not as much as my editor wanted me, or he wanted it less. Export credit agencies are part of the state, so therefore they are bound by the international human rights obligations that the state has signed up to. So they should be doing exactly what you're talking about. MIGA, the World Bank's equivalent, should be doing exactly the same thing. So there should be more of that. But they're very quiet, sort of rather submissive organisations, in my experience, with the export credit agencies. Maybe they can be pushed out of their hole. With respect to, yes, the legal issue. Well, I mean, one of the reasons, when I say not to emphasise the law, what I tried not to do, and what I actually made a very specific decision not to do, was to provide in the last chapter, as it were, a blueprint of what laws should be changed. I just knew that that would create a focus on that, and that would be picked apart. Whereas that was not what I was trying to do. What I was trying to do is say, we need a cultural change within our leadership, both political and financial, but also within the human rights community. That's not going to be by law alone, though that is part of it. But it's got to be much more about taking on this idea of what the purpose is. Of what the purpose of... and Teresa agrees with me, I think. What the purpose of finance really is. What is this trying to do? But just with respect to the SDGs, at first I thought the SDGs were not that good an idea. The SDGs were perhaps, too aspirational. I mean, you look at 17 as opposed to the 8. How many? We've got 169 targets and 262 whatever indicators. But against what I thought would be the case, corporations have picked these up. I don't think they fully understand them, but they have picked them up. But the rhetoric is therefore really important. It gives us something to strive towards. So I think there can be something that can be used.
Thank you very much, David. Optimism. That's what we need.
You're a human rights lawyer. What else can you do?
So these are really high pay grade questions above mine. I think some of them. I mean, on your creating money, actually, it is an issue in the way in which the financial system's leveraged. I wouldn't go into it through human rights. I have to say, I would just say, is it safe? And I'd ask that one. On the other couple of ones, the ones about how do we get money into fragile states. I think this is an issue because if what you do is, you need to get the balance of this right, don't you? Because actually we do want businesses to be investing in very difficult places. I mean, one of the things as Treasurer of Oxfam, we couldn't get money to Somalia because the bank said we don't want anything to do with Somalia. No American bank would touch anything in Somalia, yeah? And why? Because, we might have something to do with a terrorist organization, because half the institutions in Somalia have been deemed to be terrorist. So how do we manage to get the balance of that right? I mean, for me, it would be that you start with purpose and you allow that you're never going to have this perfect. But we do need to think about all of that. And then the question about, the OECD guidelines and all of that, I think these are good things. If it was me, I would say it's not either law or deal tight the hindmost. What we're trying to create is a civil economy. We have a thing that's called a civil society, and it's got laws, and it's got a parliament, and it's got cabinet and people that come on the radio, but it's got political parties, it's got freedom of the speech, it's got my human rights that I'm allowed to say and do what I want. That might be what we're looking for in this as well, with a recognition that companies and banks do need to think about how they respect these. That doesn't mean that the financial system is responsible for all the woes or for all the wheels, the good things, in the world. But it does mean that it's got some sort of responsibility there. Some of that you may want to put in soft law, some of that you may want to put in hard law, but most of it has to be the way that we do things around here. And that would seem to me to be, it's that civil economy that we're trying to create, that is one that is increasingly more respectful of human rights as time goes by.
Great. I mean, I very much agree with a lot of what's been said. Just very quickly to pick up on what David said in relation to the point about the activities of banks and creating money. I think we do need to acknowledge that, of course, when banks do that, we are talking about finance that's generated, about lending that then occurs in the real economy. And it's very interesting to look at how that's changed over time, that we've seen the significance of lending in relation to property grow very, very, very substantially, and that business actually reduces a proportion. So there's a question about whether that allocation is correct. Most analysts would suggest that it isn't, But then you say, well, what do you do about it? You know, is this do you need to have carrots to try and make investment in more productive activities more attractive? Do you need to have sticks to try and force that to happen as well? And probably you need to have a bit of a combination of the two. I mean, we've suggested, for example, that you know, be sensible to look at the Bank of England's mandate, keep it independent, but if you added to that a requirement for it to focus on productivity, then it could use that when it's assessing some of these processes, which we think would be sensible. I would just also mention what David said on, other David, around this, that of course we have also had the bail-in mechanism being created at EU level. Now, of course, lots of commentators say, well, it's not big enough, but it is there, and it was achieved through very concerted campaigning and action by a whole range of different actors, actually. So I think we should kind of acknowledge that. Then just finally, this question about investment in kind of more difficult contexts. I think it's a really, really important question, and actually it's a subset of a much wider issue that I think impacts on all of us who are trying to think about these matters and how the power of finance really can be used as effectively as possible. If you look at the domestic economy, for example, I mean, I represent Oxford East. I know that if an investor puts some money into a company there, then probably it's going to do pretty well. They'll have a good return. If they're investing in a company that's much more isolated, that doesn't have all those connections, but is in part of the country that really needs that investment even more, you know, the returns will be lower, but to an extent the investment is more required. So what do you do about it? We've talked about export credit guarantee departments. I think it's peculiar, to put it mildly, that there is such a focus on defence contracts within the UK's export credit guarantee approach. I find that strange, given that their size within the economy. We have had organisations that are meant to focus precisely on this. I'm going to get the acronym for it wrong. Is it CDC, the development, right? Where you know, there's been some debate. I'll put it like that. Whether it's always been focused on the right area. But then finally, I think we can focus on delivering really additionality, I suppose, some of the time through pump priming by public funding. I think sometimes that is necessary, and that's what certainly the EU acknowledged when it created this European Fund for Strategic Investments, which was trying to say, well, you know, in order to get private investment into some areas, you sometimes need to have some public priming, pump priming. Of course, the public sector gets money back at the end of the day, but you sometimes need to get over that first hump of risk initially before you can pull the private sector in as well.
Thank you very much. So with that, I think we're ready to close the evening. I think it just falls to me. First of all, just to say, for me, you know, I think we've heard an extraordinary panel of speakers who've really been able to talk about the finance in terms of its extraordinary potential, both for emancipation as well as for harm. And the challenge must be now to look at the ways in which finance can be encouraged and controlled and incentivised to move in the right directions. And that's going to take normative cases, it's going to take a business case, it's going to take an ethical case, and it'll take legal structures and frameworks as well. And it's the combination of those that will actually deliver the kind of world that we want to see, where genuinely finance can contribute not only to the broad realisation of human rights, but also to that civil economy that David finished with. So it falls to me finally just to say thanks to you for coming this evening. Thanks also for the questions. Thank you to my colleagues from the Resource Centre who worked very hard to make this event possible for us all. Thanks also to Herbert Smith Freehills and to Adam for the generosity of providing the event, the venue. Thanks particularly to our expert panel for coming and making the responses that they've made. And then finally, a big thanks to David Kinley for coming and presenting his book to us. So thank you very much, everybody.